Okay, for problem 68, we just have to find the cross product of the vectors given. So part A, we have the cross product of my vector A, which is 2, -4. Let's see if I can do this a little better. I'll write this. Okay, problem 68, University Physics by OpenStax. So you notice that I wrote this vector down, but I wrote it in components, with the x component in the first column, the y component in the second, and the z component in the third column. I'll do the same for the next vector. And what I'm going to do first is I'm going to ignore this column and take the product of these two quantities minus the product of these two quantities. And that is going to be my x component. So I'm going to have -4 times 10 is -40. 0 times 4 is 0. And that's my x component. Now, the next one I'm going to subtract. And I'm going to ignore this column. And I am going to use the product of these two numbers minus the product of these two numbers. And that is going to be my y component. Two times 10 is 20. 0 times 3 is 0. That's my y component. Finally, for my z component, I ignore this column and I take the product of these two numbers minus the product of these two numbers. Two times 10 is 20. 0 times 3 is 0. And now it's just a matter of simplifying. So my vector A cross C is equal to -40x minus 20y plus 20 c hat. Okay, now for part B, we have A cross C where A is 3, 4, 10, and C is 2, -4, and 0. So I'm looking at these two quantities. Okay, so again, I'm gonna ignore this, cross multiply these quantities, and that will be my x component. So 4 times 0 is 0. And 10 times -4 is -40. Now it's this quantity minus that quantity. Thus, that -40 becomes a +40. And that's my x component. For my y component, I put a negative sign. I ignore the y column, and I cross multiply these quantities. That'll be 0 minus 20. And finally, for the z component, I ignore the z column, and I cross multiply these quantities. Now I just simplify. And there's my answer. Okay, for part C, I'm going to consider this as my vector A and this as my vector C. Now the only difference here is that you're not explicitly given the k components of the vectors. So that's okay, you just assume it to be 0. So your cross product A cross C would be equal to -3, -4, 0, and -3 and 4. X, Y, and C obviously correspond to I, J, and K. Alright, well, that just becomes 0 minus 0. That's your 0 in the x direction, minus 0 minus 0, which is 0 in the y direction, plus -12 minus -12. So that's -12 minus 12. In the c direction, so in this case, A cross C is equal to -24 in Z. This is the same as writing 0x plus 0y minus 24z. Okay, now let's do the last one, where we will be considering these two vectors. All right. My vector A cross vector C will be x, y, z. My vector A has no components along the x and z directions. And my vector C has components -2, 3, and 2. Alright, so this times that, -18 minus 0 x hat minus 0 minus 0, which is going to be 0, plus 0 minus 18. Okay, I hope that helped.